The flight was supposed to be calm, long, and uneventful. Everyone believed it would be just another journey across the sky. Among the passengers sat a quiet young woman in the middle rows. She kept her hands folded, her eyes low, and her breathing steady. She did not talk to anyone, did not ask for anything, and did not even raise her head when the cabin crew made announcements. She looked like the kind of person who wanted no attention at all. Most people hardly noticed her. Some passengers were busy with movies, others with chatting or reading. But if someone had looked closely, they would have seen something different in her eyes, something sharp, alert, trained. She wasn't just sitting silently. She was observing everything, every sound, every movement, every vibration of the aircraft, but nobody knew that. To them, she was just a quiet girl traveling alone. The cabin lights were dim, food trays were being collected, and the plane hummed peacefully at 30,000 feet. A soft layer of clouds floated below. The passengers felt relaxed, unaware that the calm sky was only hiding what was coming. Up front, in the cockpit, the captain was talking casually with the first officer. They had flown this route many times. Nothing seemed unusual until the first officer suddenly paused, pressed his hand against his chest, and leaned forward slightly. The captain looked over, surprised. "You okay?" he asked. The first officer nodded weakly, but his face turned pale. Before the captain could call the cabin crew or ask for assistance, the first officer collapsed sideways, his headset falling off. At the same moment, the captain's heart began to race. A cold sweat formed on his forehead. He reached for the radio, but his hand trembled. The control panel blurred in front of him. He tried to focus, but the world felt distant and heavy. Within seconds, the cockpit went silent except for warning chimes and the continuous hum of the engines. 2 pilots. 2 problems. One collapsing, and the other losing control of his body. The plane continued forward on autopilot, but inside the cockpit, there was no one left fully conscious. In the cabin, the passengers didn't know anything yet. The crew continued routine tasks, believing the pilots were flying safely. But the quiet girl in the middle seat lifted her head suddenly. She felt something change. She couldn't explain it, but she sensed it, a shift in the engines, a delay in communication, a silent gap that shouldn't exist. Her training whispered inside her mind, urging her to stay alert. A few minutes later, one of the flight attendants walked briskly toward the cockpit. She knocked once, no response. She knocked again, louder. Still no answer. Her smile slowly faded. She pressed the emergency code to unlock the door. When the door slid open, she froze. Both pilots were slumped over their seats. Her breath shook. She stepped back, her voice breaking as she called for help through the intercom. "If there is any passenger on board with flying experience, please come to the front immediately." The announcement echoed across the cabin. Panic spread instantly. People looked at one another, mouths open, eyes wide. The hum of the engines no longer felt peaceful. It felt threatening. Some passengers gasped. Others clutched their armrests. A few whispered prayers. No one moved. The quiet girl closed her eyes. She did not want to stand. She wanted to stay invisible, unnoticed, uninvolved. She carried a past she didn't want anyone to know, a past she was escaping from, hoping for peace. But the announcement, repeated again, more urgent this time. Her fingers tightened around her seatbelt buckle. She knew what was happening. She knew what it meant. She knew the danger, and she knew she was the only one on board who could help. Slowly, she unbuckled her belt. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of flying, but from fear of being recognized. She had walked away from her life in the skies. She had walked away from a call sign that once made her respected and feared across airfields. A call sign she had promised herself she would never hear again. But right now, 200 passengers were depending on someone. Anyone. She stood quietly, avoiding every gaze, and walked toward the front. People stepped aside as she passed, unsure of who she was or why she moved with such calm confidence. When she reached the cockpit door, the cabin crew stared at her with desperate eyes. "Do you have flying experience?" one attendant whispered. Young woman didn't speak. She only nodded, stepped inside, and took a slow breath. Her eyes scanned the controls in one quick sweep. Her calmness shocked the crew. She gently pushed the captain's chair upright and checked his pulse. Weak but alive. She glanced at the first officer, same condition, both unconscious. She murmured. The attendants waited anxiously for her next words. She sat down, adjusted the headset, and touched the control yoke with steady hands. When she spoke into the radio, her voice was calm, firm, practiced, nothing like the silent girl they had seen all flight. "Control, this is Flight 7. She began, and the controller froze on the other side of the radio, because the moment she spoke, he recognized the voice, and he whispered into his mic, stunned, "Is that your call sign?" She didn't answer, not yet. Because saying it aloud meant revealing everything she had been running from. The radio crackled softly in her headset, and the young woman kept her eyes forward, refusing to answer the controller's question. She wasn't ready, not yet. Her call sign belonged to a part of her life she had locked away. A part filled with pressure, broken nights, and a final moment she could never forget. She didn't want it back. But the sky didn't wait for anyone's past or pain. "Flight 7, do you copy?" The controller asked again, this time more carefully, as if he already knew the truth. She took a slow breath and forced her voice steady. "I copy," she said. "We have a medical emergency. Both pilots are unconscious. Autopilot is holding. I need vectors to the nearest suitable airport." The cabin crew watched her, fear mixed with relief. This quiet girl had suddenly become the only thread holding 200 lives above the earth. Her calmness was surprising, almost unsettling. She didn't even hesitate. She spoke like someone who had sat in this seat many times before, but she didn't look proud. She looked tired, like stepping back into a world she thought she had left forever. Down in the cabin, passengers whispered nervously, some cried softly. Others held hands. No one knew who the girl was, but they felt a strange comfort knowing someone had taken control. Up front, she scanned the monitors and checked the aircraft status. Everything seemed stable for now, but she knew that stability in the sky could break at any moment. She needed to prepare for every possibility. She secured the captain's headset over his ear, making sure he was breathing, then shifted her attention back to the controls. "Flight 7, confirm fuel level," the controller instructed. She checked quickly. "Fuel is enough for diversion, but not for delays." "Copy that." "Stand by for descent clearance," the voice replied. The girl nodded to herself. She knew exactly what she had to do. Her mind felt sharper than it had in months, maybe years. Muscle memory returned quietly, like a ghost standing behind her, guiding her hands, but with it came the memories she wished would disappear. A runaway aircraft, a storm, a decision she had to make alone, a life she couldn't save. Her call sign whispered in her mind, like a shadow behind her ear. She shook her head gently, trying to focus on the present. A flight attendant placed a hand on the back of the chair. Are we safe for now?" she asked softly. The young woman didn't look up. "For now," she said. "But I need you to keep the cabin calm. No panic, no running around. Make sure people are seated and buckled." The attendant nodded and rushed out. The girl placed her hands on the throttle gently. She hadn't touched one in almost a year. It felt heavier than she remembered. The radio clicked again. "Flight 7, this is Control. I need the name of the person flying the aircraft." She paused. The controller wasn't asking for her legal name. He was asking for the name she used in the air. The one printed on her flight jacket. The one whispered in airbases. The one shouted into radios during emergencies. The one she had buried. She inhaled slowly. "Just call me the acting pilot," she replied. "That isn't enough." Controller said softly, "If you are who I think you are, we need to know." She didn't answer. Instead, she looked outside. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in orange and gold. The clouds below glowed softly, as if the world was holding its breath with her. She had dreamed of sunsets like this when she first learned to fly. Back then, the sky felt like home. It felt safe. It felt like a place where she belonged. Now it felt like a test. "Flight 7, the controller called again. "You are cleared to descend 2,000 feet. Begin now." She eased the throttle, adjusted the vertical speed, and felt the aircraft respond smoothly. It was like the plane recognized her touch. As if it trusted her, the cabin crew watched in awe. She didn't panic. She didn't shake. She moved like flowing water, steady, controlled, precise. One crew member whispered to another, "She's not a normal passenger." The girl heard it, but she didn't react. She focused on the instruments, the radio, the changing pitch of the engines. Every detail mattered. Suddenly, a warning beep sounded. She frowned. Wind shear detected in the distance, mild, but enough to complicate descent. "Control. Confirm weather ahead," she said. "Copy." A small turbulence pocket reported. "Should pass before you reach it." She exhaled. Good. But the deeper she descended, the stronger the pressure in her chest grew, not from fear of flying, but from fear of being discovered. Her call sign had once made her a legend in emergency training videos. People trusted her, looked up to her. But they didn't know the ending of her story. They didn't know why she stopped, and she didn't want them to. Yet here she was, saving a plane again, saving strangers again. "Flight 7, the controller said suddenly. "Is this really you?" "The one they used to call." She cut him off sharply, her voice firm but quiet. "Don't say it." The controller fell silent. The cabin crew stared at her, confused. She didn't give them an explanation. Instead, she said only one thing, in a voice steady enough to make everyone hold their breath. "Right now, it doesn't matter who I am. It only matters that we land safely." Asterisk. The descent continued smoothly, but the young woman could feel the tension building inside the aircraft like a quiet storm. Every second mattered. Every sound mattered. Every small vibration from the engines felt louder than before. She kept her eyes on the instruments, her breathing slow and controlled. She could do this. She had done this before. But she had never wanted to again. Yet the sky didn't care what she wanted. The passengers didn't care who she used to be. All they needed was someone who knew how to keep the plane in the air. "Flight 7, you're approaching the turbulence pocket," the controller said calmly. "Maintain heading. Expect slight bumps." She nodded silently. She had flown through far worse storms, but the cabin behind her, they didn't know that. She could already hear a few gasps whenever the plane shook even a little. The flight attendant stood near the cockpit door, watching her closely. "Is everything all right?" she whispered. "For now," the young woman answered without looking up. "Stay buckled. Make sure everyone remains seated." Another gentle shake. Passengers clutched their armrests. A child cried softly. A man whispered a prayer. The quiet girl kept flying, her hands steady, her voice calm. She had flown combat transports before. She had handled engine failures, crosswinds, and emergency landings. But the situation felt different. Not because the plane was in danger, she could handle that. It was the 100 pairs of eyes behind her. The responsibility of people who didn't even know her name. The weight felt heavier than any aircraft she had ever flown. "Control," she said. "Report updated wind pattern. Wind's calming. You're past the worst of the turbulence zone." The controller responded gently. She allowed herself one small breath of relief. But it didn't last long. A soft groan came from the captain's seat. She turned quickly. His eyelids twitched, his fingers moved slightly, but he was still far from conscious. The first officer didn't move at all. Their condition meant one thing. She would have to land the aircraft completely on her own. Her heart tightened, not from fear, but from memory. The last time she had faced a cockpit emergency alone, she had survived. But someone else hadn't. That night stayed inside her like a bruise that never healed. It was the reason she walked away from flying, the reason she chose silence, the reason she avoided anything that reminded her of the sky. And now the sky had pulled her back. Flight 7. The controller called again, softer this time. Your descent path is confirmed. You are 20 minutes from final approach. I'm sending emergency crews to the runway. The girl felt pressure in her chest. She could almost hear her old instructor's voice. You can do this. The sky listens to calm hands. She pushed those memories away, trying to focus on the present. But then the controller spoke again, hesitant, emotional. I know you don't want to say your call sign, he said quietly. But I trained under someone with your voice. Someone who saved many lives, if it's really you. Then the passengers on this plane are in the safest hands possible. She closed her eyes for a second. His words hit deeper than he knew. She didn't feel like a hero. Not after everything. Not after the night she tried to forget. The flight attendant stepped closer. Why is the controller talking to you like that? She asked carefully. Who are you really? The young woman didn't answer. She didn't want the cabin crew to look at her differently. She didn't want to carry any title, any praise, any reputation. She only wanted to land the plane and go back to being invisible. But the flight attendant wasn't blind. She saw the sharp focus in the girl's eyes, the controlled breathing, the professional movements. Something inside her whispered a truth she couldn't ignore. You've done this before, the attendant whispered. Haven't you? The girl didn't deny it. She only said, we'll talk after landing. Suddenly, an alert beeped. A small one, but enough to make her nerves tighten. She checked the display. One of the sensors was giving unstable readings. Not critical, not dangerous, but enough to make landing trickier, of course. Emergencies never came alone. Control. I need runway length. The longest possible, she said firmly. Copy. Diverting you to the main runway. 7 miles long. Good. The passengers felt the plane tilt slightly as she aligned it with the new heading. Some panicked. Some prayed louder. But the young woman stayed calm, her voice steady, her hands firm. Inside her mind, she ran through every landing she had ever done. Every emergency drill. Every mistake she promised herself never to repeat. She couldn't fail. Not again. A soft voice crackled through the radio. If you're really who I think you are, the controller said gently, then your call sign is known for one thing: bringing people home. She looked straight ahead. Her call sign, the name she carried in the skies, the name she abandoned, the name she feared. It wasn't ready to return. Not yet. But for the first time on this flight, she whispered something under her breath, barely audible, but filled with determination. I will bring them home. And as the wheels of the plane dipped toward the glowing lights of the city below, every passenger unknowingly trusted their lives to the silent girl who once ruled the sky. The lights of the city stretched below like a glowing river, marking the beginning of their descent toward land. The passengers didn't know how close they were to danger, and maybe that was a blessing. Fear spreads quickly on an airplane. Panic spreads even faster. But the young woman in the cockpit had no room for either. She kept her gaze forward, every muscle in her body focused. She listened to the engine pitch, the wind patterns, the autopilot clicks, things most passengers never even notice. To her, they were signs, messages, warnings. Flight 7. The controller said softly, You're approaching initial approach point. Reduce speed when ready." She adjusted the throttle gently. The aircraft responded with a smooth hum, almost as if trusting her completely. She didn't smile, but something in her chest eased for a moment. Flying, no matter how much she tried to run from it, still felt like breathing. The flight attendant appeared again at the cockpit door. She had stopped shaking by now, but her eyes still held fear. "Some passengers are asking what's happening," she whispered. "Should I tell them anything?" "Tell them the plane is under control," the young woman said simply. "Nothing more. And, are we safe?" The attendant asked. The girl hesitated. Not because she doubted herself, but because she knew landing was the hardest part. "If everyone stays calm," she said, "I'll get you all down." The attendant nodded and left, her movements steadier this time. The aircraft shook lightly as it crossed a thin layer of uneven air. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make a few passengers gasp. The young woman ignored the small bumps. She was focused on something else now. The runway lights coming into view through the front glass. The dark line of land stretched ahead, lit by red and white lights. Emergency vehicles waited near the edge, their sirens off but ready. They didn't know who was flying the plane, but their readiness showed one thing. They believed something miraculous was happening in the cockpit. Once again, the radio crackled. The controller's voice softened as if speaking to someone he admired. "Flight 7, winds are calm. Your landing path is clear. Emergency crews are standing by." She closed her eyes briefly. Calm winds, clear path. Good signs, but then a soft groan came from the captain's side. One eye opened halfway. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak, barely air. She leaned toward him. "Don't talk. You're not in condition to take control. Just stay still." His lips moved, forming silent words she couldn't understand. Then his eyes drifted shut. Again, her jaw tightened. She had hoped he would wake enough to help guide the landing, even if only with his experience. But she was alone. Truly alone. The controller spoke again, hesitating. "Flight 7, do you want me to contact the airbase?" "They might—" "No." Her voice cut him off. "No airbase, no military contact. No call sign. Just guide me through civilian approach." "But if you are who I'm not," she said firmly. "Not anymore." There was a long pause on the radio. The controller accepted her words, even if he didn't believe them. She lowered the flaps, watching the airplane adjust. The runway grew larger, clearer. Her heartbeat slowed into a controlled rhythm. This moment, the quiet before landing, felt strangely familiar. Like stepping back into a memory she both loved and hated. She whispered to herself, "Steady, steady." The nose dipped slightly. She corrected it. She kept the wings level. Every micro movement mattered now. Far behind her, the cabin had gone almost silent. Passengers could feel something changing. A few held hands across aisles, some whispered prayers. Some stared out windows, searching for comfort in the lights. Below, none of them knew the silent girl flying their plane once taught pilots how to land in storms. None of them knew she had once carried a reputation that followed her across continents. None of them knew she had stopped flying because of one night, where she made the right decision, but paid the wrong price. The aircraft crossed the final approach marker. "Flight 7, the controller said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're cleared to land." She swallowed. "Copy." For a moment, the cockpit felt weightless. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her eyes didn't blink. Her breathing slowed into something controlled, trained. The wheels were still far from the ground, but every inch felt like a lifetime. Then a sudden gust of wind hit the right side of the aircraft. The plane tilted. Passengers screamed. The cockpit alarm beeped once, but the young woman didn't panic. Her hands moved instantly, correcting the tilt with a sharp, precise action, an action no normal passenger would ever know how to do. but she knew it. She knew it well. The plane leveled again. Silence filled the cabin. Shocked, terrified silence. The controller, who had heard the alarms through the radio, spoke urgently. "Flight 7, respond. Are you stable?" She pressed the radio button calmly. "I have control." Her voice was steady, too steady for someone who wasn't trained. The controller whispered something she didn't respond to. Only one pilot in the world used to talk like that. She shut him out and focused. This was it. Landing was seconds away. She guided the aircraft toward the runway lights. Her movements smooth, confident, almost graceful. And for the first time in a long time, the sky didn't feel like her enemy. It felt like it remembered her. The runway lights grew brighter with every passing second. The young woman held her breath as she aligned the aircraft perfectly with the center line. She had done this hundreds of times before, but never with a plane full of strangers depending on her. Never after walking away from the sky for so long. The engines hummed steadily, responding to her touch like old friends returning after years apart. The cabin behind her had gone almost completely silent. People could sense the plane lowering, inching closer to the ground. Some tightened their seatbelts. Some closed their eyes. Some whispered hopes to the dark space around them. Inside the cockpit, her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the runway lights flashing in front of her. She had trained for this. She had lived for this. Yet she had promised herself she would never do it again. And now she was doing it to save people who didn't even know her name. The radio crackled softly. The controller's voice was low, careful. "Flight 7, you're 200 feet above ground. Keep nose steady." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hands adjusted the controls with precision that came from years of experience she tried so hard to bury. 90 feet, 50 feet. The wheels hovered just above the runway, waiting for her command. Then, the unexpected happened. Crosswind hit the aircraft, small, but sharp enough to push the nose slightly off alignment. Gasps echoed from the cabin. The cockpit alarm blinked, but she didn't hesitate. Her left hand gripped the yoke with strength. Her right hand adjusted the throttle, and she corrected the plane in one smooth, confident motion. The aircraft straightened again, skimming over the runway with perfect balance. Her breath steadied. 30 feet. She eased the controls. 20 feet. Her heart began to slow. 10 feet. The wheels reached for the ground. And then touchdown. The tires hit the runway with a firm but controlled thud. The aircraft bounced gently once and settled. She deployed the spoilers. The wings flattened. The plane gripped the earth after a long, frightening descent. But it wasn't over. The runway still rushed beneath them, speeding by in bright streaks. She needed to stop the aircraft safely, straight, centered, and smooth. She pulled the reverse thrust. The engines roared backward. The plane slowed. Slower. Finally. The aircraft rolled to a gentle crawl and moved to a quiet stop near the emergency vehicles. Silence. A deep, heavy silence that lasted long enough for her to hear her own breathing. Then from the cabin, a wave of emotion broke free. Crying, laughing, whispered thank yous, shocked voices filled with disbelief. People hugging each other. People covering their faces with shaking hands. They were safe. She had brought them home, but she did not celebrate. She did not even smile. She pressed her elbows against her knees and lowered her head for a moment. Relief washed over her in a strange, heavy way, like something she had held inside for years had been opened again. A voice from the radio finally spoke, soft with awe. "Flight 7, that landing was perfect." She didn't respond. The controller hesitated. "I know. You told me not to use your call sign. But after what you just did, I think everyone deserves to know who saved them." She reached forward and switched off the headset before he could finish. She didn't want her past to come alive again. Not now. Not ever. The flight attendant stepped into the cockpit, her eyes filled with tears she tried hard to hide. The passengers, They want to thank whoever saved them. They think the pilots woke up and landed the plane. The young woman's chest tightened. It was better that way. They didn't need to know the truth. They don't have to know. She said quietly. The attendant shook her head softly. But I do. She stared at the young woman with a mix of disbelief and respect. Who are you? She whispered. The girl didn't answer. She stood up slowly, her legs still slightly unsteady from the adrenaline. She glanced at the captain and first officer, still unconscious, still breathing. They would recover. They would live. She had done what she came to do. The attendant stepped closer. Please, tell me, you're not just a passenger. No one lands a plane like that unless... A knock at the cockpit door cut her off. A passenger stood there, trembling, eyes red from crying. He must have opened the emergency phone line and heard everything. His voice shook as he spoke. Miss, whoever you are. Thank you. More faces appeared behind him, some smiling weakly. Some in disbelief, some still shaking. But all of them were looking only at her. Not at the pilots, not at the crew, only her. She felt her heart pressed tightly against her ribs. She wasn't used to being seen like this. She didn't want to be seen like this, but she couldn't walk away yet. Not while the emergency crews were still approaching. Not while the plane was still buzzing with fear, confusion, and gratitude. She looked at the passengers, then at the runway lights outside, then finally at the flight attendant. With a low, tired voice, she said only, I used to fly. The attendant stared at her. Used to? The young woman nodded slowly, then she added under her breath, a long time ago. Before the attendant could ask anything else, a voice outside shouted, We need to evacuate the aircraft. And once again, the weight of all responsibility fell onto the silent girl who had just saved 200 lives. Asterisk. The emergency teams rushed toward the aircraft, their flashing lights coloring the windows red and blue. The passengers slowly stood up, shaking, wiping tears, trying to understand what had just happened. Some looked toward the cockpit, hoping to see the pilots coming out, but they didn't. Instead, the young woman stepped out first. Her steps were slow, heavy. She wasn't used to attention. She didn't want it. She had spent months trying to disappear into ordinary life. But now 200 people stared at her with gratitude she didn't know how to carry. A paramedic rushed past her, into the cockpit to assist the unconscious pilots. Another paramedic asked her gently, Are you hurt? Do you need medical help? She shook her head. No, I'm fine. But inside, she felt anything but fine. The passengers were being guided out through the emergency stairs. As each person exited, they kept looking at her, the quiet girl they barely noticed during the flight, now standing straight despite exhaustion. Some nodded at her, some whispered thank you. Some touched their hearts. She looked down each time, uncomfortable, wishing she could just vanish. One mother hugged her crying child as they passed and said softly, You saved us. I hope you know that. The young woman didn't answer, but something inside her chest tightened. When the last group of passengers exited, the flight attendant approached her. She had red eyes from crying but a warm, trembling smile. They all think the pilots will come out soon and explain everything, she said quietly. But I told the airport staff the truth. The girl frowned gently. You didn't have to. The attendant shook her head. But I did. You deserve credit for what you did. The young woman's voice stayed low. I didn't do it for credit. I know, the attendant replied softly. Maybe that's why you deserved it even more. They both stepped outside into the cold night air. The wind brushed against her face. For a moment, she felt like the sky was breathing with her again. Controller who had been guiding her finally came running toward the scene. He wasn't wearing a uniform jacket, just his headset hanging around his neck. He stopped a few feet away, breathing fast, staring at her like he couldn't believe she was real. He took a step closer. It really is you. She looked away. I told you, I'm not that person anymore. But you are, he insisted softly. That landing. No one else could have done it the way you did. She didn't argue, but she didn't accept the praise either. He lowered his voice. I trained under your old unit. We studied recordings of your emergency landing. They told us your call sign stood for skill under pressure, calm when everyone else panicked. They said you were. She cut him off gently this time. Please, don't say it. He nodded slowly. All right, but just know, what you did today will be remembered, whether you want it or not. She didn't answer. Her heart felt heavier than ever. She had saved lives, yes, but she had also reopened something she tried so hard to close. The paramedics carried the pilots out on stretchers. They were both breathing, faces pale but recovering. The captain briefly opened his eyes and saw her standing near the runway. He didn't recognize her, but his lips formed a faint, confused smile, gratitude in his tired eyes. She nodded once at him. Nothing more. The attendant walked up beside her again. When the news crews arrive, she whispered, they're going to want to know who landed the plane. What should we tell them? The young woman closed her eyes for a few seconds. Her fingers curled slightly as if holding an invisible weight. After a long breath, she opened her eyes. Tell them, she said softly, that a passenger helped until the pilots recovered. Nothing more. The attendant looked concerned. Ah. You sure? This was your moment. No, the girl replied quietly. This was just my responsibility. I don't want anything else. Before the attendant could speak again, the girl stepped away from the crowd. She walked toward the back of the emergency vehicles where the shadows were deeper and the attention faded. She didn't want applause. She didn't want interviews. She didn't want the world to know she had returned to the sky. Even for a moment, all she wanted was peace. But the controller followed her, stopping her gently. Can I ask you one last thing? He said softly. She hesitated, then nodded. Why? Did you stop flying? He asked. She looked at the ground. Silence stretched for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because the last time I landed a plane, someone I cared about didn't make it. I blamed myself. I still do. The controller's expression softened. But you saved everyone tonight. She looked toward the aircraft, its windows still glowing softly in the dark. Tonight wasn't about proving anything, she said. It was about doing what needed to be done. He nodded slowly. Then, will you ever return to flying? She shook her head gently. No, my life is quiet now. I'd like to keep it that way. He smiled sadly. Even if the sky still remembers your call sign? Her eyes glistened. For the first time, I can't erase it, she murmured. But I don't have to answer to it anymore. The wind brushed her face again, cold, peaceful, like a goodbye from the sky itself. She turned, started walking toward the terminal, blending slowly into the shadows of the night. No one followed her. No one called after her. And she preferred it that way. The world would never know her name. The passengers would never know who guided them home. But somewhere in the tower, one controller whispered into an empty mic. She didn't want her call sign said. But everyone tonight was saved. By the one they used to call Sky Ghost. She heard it faintly from the distance. She didn't turn around. She simply walked on quiet, steady, disappearing back into the ordinary life she chose. The sky had borrowed her once more, and she had given it everything. Morning light touched the airport hours later, turning the glass windows gold. Most passengers had gone home, still shaken, but grateful to be alive. News reporters filled the terminal, hoping for a statement from anyone about the mysterious passenger who saved Flight 7. But the young woman was already gone. She walked quietly along the less crowded side of the building, keeping her hood up, avoiding every camera, every curious glance. Her steps were slow, thoughtful. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel special. She only felt tired in a way that reached her bones, but something inside her had changed. Saving that plane had unlocked a place she had kept shut for a long time. It wasn't pain this time. It wasn't fear. It was something softer, something she didn't know how to name. She reached a bench near the far end of the terminal, where the early morning travelers barely noticed her. She sat down and looked at the sunrise through the tall windows. The sky glowed orange and pink colors she once loved more than anything. The sky had taken so much from her, yet tonight it had given something back. Breathing slowly, she lowered her head. A soft voice interrupted the silence. "I thought I might find you here." She didn't need to turn around. She knew the voice, the air traffic controller who had guided her through the night. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. He held a small paper cup of tea and offered it to her. She hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet thank you. "I'm not here to bother you," he said gently. "I just wanted to check if you were all right." She took a sip of the warm tea. "I'm fine." But her voice carried a softness he hadn't heard earlier. He sat beside her, leaving space so she wouldn't feel crowded. For a moment, neither spoke. The airport announcements echoed faintly. Luggage wheels rolled across the floor. Somewhere nearby, a family laughed, celebrating a reunion after a long night. "You know," the controller finally said. "The crew said the passengers are calling you an angel. Some said you appeared out of nowhere. Others think you were trained secretly by the airline." She allowed a tiny, tired smile. "Let them believe whatever makes them feel safe." "Will you tell me your call sign now?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "You already know it," he smiled. "Yes, I do. But I wanted to hear you say it." "I don't say it anymore," she whispered. "Saying it makes that part of my life real again. And I'm not sure I want that." He nodded respectfully. "Fair enough." They sat again in silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Two people who shared a moment the world would never fully understand. Eventually he said, "Can I ask you something else?" She looked at him, curiosity softening her eyes. "When you were landing the plane, when everything was on your shoulders, what were you thinking about?" She took a long breath. "Not my past. Not what people would say. Not even the danger," she replied softly. "I just thought about the passengers, the child crying, the man praying, the woman clutching her seat. I thought, if I have one more landing left in me, it should be for people who need it." His eyes softened. "Then you did more than save a plane. You found yourself again." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she believed that yet. He stood up slowly. "The airport director wants to meet you." "But I told him you were already gone." She looked up in surprise. "Why?" "Because you earned your peace," he said simply. "And because some stories don't need cameras. Some stories live quietly in the hearts of the people who were there." That touched her in a way she didn't expect. She lowered her eyes. He took a step back. "If you ever decide to fly again, even as a hobby, even just once, call the tower, ask for me. I'd like to be the voice guiding you again." She didn't respond, but her silence wasn't rejection. It was simply her way of acknowledging something she couldn't yet put into words. He gave her a final nod and walked away. The young woman remained seated, watching the sunrise shift into brighter daylight. The sky looked different, now, not like an enemy, not like a memory, but like a place that would always be a part of her, whether she wanted it or not. She stood up slowly and adjusted her bag. Before leaving, she glanced at the runway in the distance, the same runway where hours ago she had landed a plane full of strangers who would remember her forever, even though they never knew her name. She whispered one last time, so quietly. The wind almost carried it away. "I'm not coming back to the sky, but thank you for letting me fly one last time." And with that, she walked away calm, steady, disappearing into the growing crowd of morning travelers. A quiet girl once. More, but now. A quiet girl the sky would never forget.